I need to I would like to also take this time uh, because we are doing this collaboration with University of Melbourne. So I would like to acknowledge the country of Australia. So I'll read this. As this symposium is being co-hosted by the University of Melbourne, which is situated on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. All right. I just will do just a short introduction. My name is Ian Wu, program leader for MA Fine Arts, and I'll be chairing this session. Yeah, and just to remind everyone that each person will be given 10 minutes to present and a 10-minute Q&A, right? And the Q&A would be via the chat box. So I probably will read out to you some of the questions, and then it depends on the timing, how much we can cover the grounds. All right. So we have already started recording this session, and I will do a short introduction as well before each speaker comes in. All right. And we will try to keep to the timing. We will start now, and I will start by reading out the biography for the first presenter for today, Pratibha Nambiar, MA Fine Arts candidate, McNally School of Fine Arts, LaSalle College of the Arts. And her title of the presentation is Capturing Presence. Oscillating between drawings and objects, Pratibha Nambiar, born in India, has a keen interest in creating a discourse on the unexplained, especially in the performative elements of the everyday. Her current practice revolves between conceptual drawings and rituals. Some of her research concerns include asking what rituals are and how they are formed. The body of work created is an outcome of this exploration, a dialogue between the performative and transitory elements of rituals in the everyday and the abstracted forms of cultural traditions. So welcome, Pratibha, and you can share screen now.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Ian. Um, um, Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, whoever's here. And hi, I'm Pratibha. My former studies in fine arts were done in India, where I specialized mainly in painting. My work then was varied and concentrated mainly on objects of the narrative. I've also worked as an IB teacher. It was at this time that I felt my work still lacked a certain certainty, which was what led me to pursue my master's in fine arts at LaSalle. Before I begin talking about my practice, I would like to give you a background into why and what made me choose this research subject. Most of my upbringing was done in India, but I have never stayed at one place for too long. Every 3 years, we'd shift and begin again. Though my mother made it a point to make us follow certain customs, with every move, the rituals itself slightly altered. Travel has a way of changing one's perception. In short, my practice is based on rituals, but I've explored the most abstract sense of the term. I agree with Catherine Ambel that rituals can't be entirely universal, as there is always a distorted version of one's culture involved in it. So, my work, in my view, walks the line between being universal and culturally linked. My initial practice started with drawings of circles. I felt the form circle represented a whole that encompasses the whole body and one's surrounding. What happened when it's repeated? By repeating an action, you become involved in it, and a part of you gets in it. What's fascinating was that every circle I made was different every day. It is never the same. This dichotomy, one that is practiced, that is precisely practiced regularly, and the other, the ever changing mind body that is involved in it, was what I wanted to question further. I felt drawing with its spontaneity and as of practice felt very linked to rituals. This led to creating drawings that evolved from rituals. I separated both concepts and concentrated on points that interested me. Rituals being so difficult to define objectively, I decided to take a subjective route by questioning my understanding of rituals, a practice that requires one's presence, being mentally and physically involved in the action. In this work, I worked with the lino cut printmaking method. I liked how one had to keep chipping into the lino sheet to slowly reveal an image. But the more one kept removing pieces of the lino sheet, the image slowly disappeared. It begins with nothing and ends with nothing, like in life. Every minute we live, we move closer to death. Nothing remains permanent, a cyclic repetition. In this work, I've tried to relate to the transient nature of life. It is interesting to see how a set of customs, rituals is passed from generation to generation. Here I have metaphorically used ice and sandal powder. As the ice ball melts, only in essence, in this case the sandal powder, remains. Are rituals a reflection of one's generation's understanding of life? Are we echoing someone's set of beliefs by repeating their actions? These are questions plagued me while I was working on this piece. There are some artists that influenced me who have also brought in ritualistic elements in their work. One of them is Sheila Gowda. I like her large scale installation art that transforms everyday ritualistic materials like human hair, incense, cow dung, and red kumkum powder into statements that question the social and economic conditions of India. Though I have used certain symbolic materials like her, I am more concerned with rituals as a personal practice and inward approach. Another is Onkwara. I like his play with the nature of consciousness and time in his work. This is something Onkwara has achieved through the use of repetition. His art making practice is a documentation of his life, like in this series, I Got Up, in which the recipient is informed through the postcard of the time and when and the location where he got up. His work is a reminiscence of a meditative ritualistic practice, but there is no emphasis given to the changing life that exists side by side. This is an aspect I found intriguing and wanted to focus on. This work is my attempt to draw based on the concept of rituals, the idea of something constant, the repetition of a set of actions, and the evanescent life that practices the actions but is never constant. I was playing with this concept of constant and motion by interpreting it through the transparency of watercolor and opaqueness of ink. As Tanya Kovacs mentions, drawings are like non moving imagery on paper, but are actually records of marks made in time. This is another work, which is a which is a series of drawings done in 21 days. It is said that an action repeated for a period of 21 days becomes a habit, perhaps a myth. However, for me, it was an attempt to question what happens when something is repeated for a period of time. What happens when for 21 days you practice a set of actions ritualistically and is recorded as marks of an event on paper. I drew the circle with no clear calculation on the left side of the paper and the square fixed with precise measurement. The square remained the same on all days, but the circle was different every single day it was created. In the middle of the slide, the difference can be noticed when two drawings done in 2 different days are overlapped. Currently, I have started working with natural colors, creating drawings with natural material, no adhesive or glue applied to it. This medium causes the drawings to fade over time. The drawings are done in layers and abstracted, creating an in betweenness between absence and presence. It is there, yet not there. In my future works, the material I'm planning of using is a soap. Soap as a substance is always linked with cleaning. It provides one a bodily experience of removing residues like dirt, a cleansing ritual. I felt the process of repeating an action every day is always a way of forgetting or washing away the past and redoing the present with fresh new actions. While experimenting, I also discovered how turmeric, when mixed with soap, gave it an abstracted sense of a memory of a ritualistic object. This work may either transgress into a video or remain as a sculpture. Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Thank you very much, Pratibha. I will open up the chat box. So welcome everyone. For those that have just arrived in, we started a little bit early. Yeah. So you can just to remind everyone that you can type your questions on the chat box. My name is Ian Wu, program leader for the MA Fine Arts, um, and I'll be chairing this session. Yeah. So Pratibha, perhaps I could ask you a question about the moving images that you will be working on, um, because you have sort of like the work with real objects. At the same time, I think you also have did the watercolors. So
Yes.
do you intend to use the watercolors as the medium to record for the moving images, or are you working with you want to continue working with the real objects?
Um, I would be experimenting with the objects too, but I would also be continuing this work, not exactly with watercolors, but mainly with natural colors. So I trying to use blue pea, flower, or turmeric, because I want the drawing itself to be something in motion, but it's sort of on, like I draw it and let it change over time. So right now the plan is to do both, is to work with the objects and with this, and I'm planning to probably go ahead with the objects in a video form where I sort of use them in a ritualistic manner, but it's still in a work in progress. So yeah.
Any questions from the room? So, since you are working on the idea of, you talked about the idea of change and the idea of the ritual. Um, and I think you use the idea of the everyday as one of the ways to record the idea of change and sequencing. So, but then you also have the images where it's between the videos and the ones that are static, you know. How do you see uh, what are your opinions about a static image that can conjure movement and change as a kind of experience where the viewer needs to take part because it is a static image, between that of a video where you are animating it, or rather making the movement more literal?
I felt videos have a way of engaging a person to see it faster, the entire process. And with drawings, the thing is the person only sees it for a short period, and it depends on each person's perception and how long he could engage in the work. And a sort of video has that upper hand of engaging someone into seeing what would happen next. So which is, sometimes I felt that when you do something very ritualistic, it's easier to interpret it in a video and also in drawings, but in a video it's sort of more, I felt it was more easier to make someone understand it better there. And yeah.
Yeah, and but it's interesting the fact that your work is you working with very basic forms. Is
Mhm,
basically an abstract narration. So even with a kind of video narrative, I think from the beginning, the middle, and end, I think it's
mhm,
quite interesting to see how does one see abstraction as having having a means to describe uh, kind of um, change, in ways that project a certain idea. Yeah.
mhm.
All right. I have a question from Victoria. Yeah. I feel that there is a strong sense for materiality in your most recent works. Do you think that your objects can also stand for themselves as as a memento of the ritualistic?
Mm, I've s- I do think that the later works have a tendency of going into this materialistic notion, but as of now, I have my thoughts are mainly about how to use these objects, but it's still a work in progress. So I would want to see how the objects would look in a video when used, and how would it look after it's used. And it's still in work in progress, but it's a very interesting question. So yeah, I'm still thinking about it.
I have a question from Regina. Could you elaborate a little on your decision to foreground the visual in these works? Would you consider engaging with the other senses, for example, the scent of soap and natural materials, the blue pea, and how it may transform?
That's a good question. Um, I I would probably think of working with scent in future. Yes, but as of now, I'm more interested in the visual aspect about how it sort of would look, especially in a video. I think it looks more interesting if I use natural colors like turmeric. But for the drawings, I've actually used blue pea flowers, um, and I haven't yet thought about the scent. I've only thought about turmeric and about natural in pigments, and used turmeric for a reason, because it's something that is used quite often in many rituals that we do back in India, and it has a two meaning to it. So it's like it's got an antiseptic um, value to it, and plus it's something that they use quite often in a lot of ritualistic practices that is done there. So which is why I started to use this quite often in my sculptures. And I have to still think about scent, but scent seems like a nice in idea to incorporate in the work, but I need to sort of think about it and see how it will be sort of associated to what I believe in rituals. And and I like the idea of using natural colors, and I have used blue pea flower in this, and in this drawing. So I like the way the color sort of faded, and I used this in my work for a reason, because I felt that, wow, as and when the I mean I wanted something that sort of faded away, because I wanted something that sort of reflected life. Because even though you practice something religiously every day, a part of you is always letting go. And I wanted a material that will also sort of disappear. And which is why I used natural pigments in for the drawings. And I wanted the drawings to sort of fade over time, but a slow fade. So yeah, I hope that answered your question, Regina.
So I think you mentioned the word disappearance, which I think is important. It helps me to also register the intention of my earlier question about the idea of the image, whether it's how it's kind of like changing. Yeah. So, all right, we have a question from Lizzie. It's interesting that you are combining what might be seen as traditional and tactile, engaging with other senses, as Regina said, with such a modern medium as video, which is more distanced or detached from the senses of smell and touch. So it's like a comment from Lizzie, if you want to respond to that.
Um, I felt video has a way of sort of, I do agree to what Lizzie said, but yes, and I like the way of the video has a way of engaging someone for a long time, and it makes it easier for someone to sort of understand what is going on better, and it's a completely different new language, which I want to see how something that is so ancient can sort of come into something as modern as in video. And it's a very nice line that you said, Lizzie. Thank you.
All right, so we will end with Pratibha's session here, and we
Mhm.
move on to Victoria Hertel. So we
Yeah.
will just have to get Pratibha. Could you
Yes.
uh, close your screen, and then we get Victoria to share her screen. And again, those who have just come in, my name is Ian Wu, program leader for MA Fine Arts, and I'm chairing this session on objects and space. And we are going to have, I'm going to read up a short biography from each candidate that's presenting. And just to let everyone know that it's a 10-minute presentation and a 10-minute Q&A. All right. So we move to Trace as Energy in Materialities by Victoria Hertel, MA Fine Arts candidate, McNally School of Fine Arts, LaSalle College of the Arts. Victoria is a German Venezuelan artist working in the field of process painting and material studies. She is interested in new materialist She's interested in new materialist theory, material-oriented phenomena, and the correlative tension between trace, surface, object, space, and viewer. Her work is characterized by a monochromatic organic aesthetic, as well as a diversified textural spectrum that converge to highlight the communicative potential of materialities. Hertel graduated from the University of Barcelona with a BFA in contemporary art practice in 2016 and has since been working as an artist in Europe and Asia. So without further ado, Victoria, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Sound is working okay? Everything's fine? Great. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Victoria, and today I will present my current research titled Trace as Energy and Materialities, which is an investigation of the work of art as sensory bridge between surface, object, space, and perceiver. It is also an exploration of the correlative tension between and within materials as an analogy for the mutual impact between human and non-human agents. The objective of the research is thereby to create pieces that open up an energized space in which the inherent dynamics of materialities can be experienced. Interaction with matter is a daily part of our lives. Every day sees innumerable interactions that influence and trigger new exchanges. My mother had a particular metaphor for the correlation between action and reaction that she never failed to recount to my sister and I when we were fighting. She would take a piece of pristine white paper, lay it flat out on the table and say, relationships are like this piece of paper. Every interaction we have leaves a mark, some more than others. And when a severe conflict arises, she would then lift the paper, crunch it up, and smooth it out again. It leaves traces that can be smoothed over, but never undone. This idea that actions can leave longer lasting marks than assumed has stuck with me ever since. Traces and marks reflect our relationship with the matter that surrounds us and that of matter itself. Aside from the importance of trace in my work as a marked effect, impression, or impact, I would also like to introduce and differentiate three other key terms that pop up throughout my presentation. These are matter, material, and materiality. Though they tend to be interchanged, there are some slight differences. Matter is the substance of which a physical object is composed. So a corporeal substance in general, whether solid, liquid, or gaseous. A material is something relating to, derived from, or consisting of matter. So specific type of matter. And materiality is the quality or state of being material. Though the materials that surround us on a daily basis seem stable in the sense that, for example, a piece of iron does not tend to disintegrate, morph, or expand before our eyes without some major catalyst, the matter that constitutes it is actually quite alive and active in itself. There's movement within the matter components of a material that causes microtransitions, which subject it to shifting, adapting, and reacting to inner and outer forces and influences. These transitions grant a material a degree of aliveness, dynamism, or to borrow the term from Jane Bennett, of vital materialism. This vital materialism turns materialities into powerful agencies that are in perpetual interchange with us. So in the same way that we change our surroundings also influence us. However, our current society's rapid production, consumption, and disposal has to a certain extent numbed our awareness to the symbiotic connection we share with the matter that constitutes and surrounds us. So through my work, I would like to heighten our perception to the communicative potential of materialities, to elicit a reevaluation of our separatist discourse with them. Before we move on to the studio practice works, I would like to address my use of the monochrome in my research. As you will see in the following slides, most of my work is in a black to gray chromatic scale. Though there are obviously many ways and methods to address the subject of materiality, I feel that in my current work, black best serves me to underscore a texture-oriented material emphasis. In addition to this, I also regard the polar and ambiguous connotations the color black evokes as a personal interest. It shares a dualist connection to the high, the low, presence and proximity, as well as absence and depth. In my work, its optical pull therefore not only assists in anchoring visual concentration on the material itself, but also to elicit a thought process on the ambiguous nature inherent in a simple element. Moving on to my current studio practice. Here I investigate two types of trace. The first, which I will introduce now, is an intrinsic, inward, or inherent trace that results from a structural adaptation and tension within a material. My methodology for this primarily involves physical-chemical experimentation with materials as a means of investigating tension between surface and volume, modified versus original form, as well as stress within a textural spectrum. This means testing out a variety of different components and how they trigger each other. Paint material plays a fundamental role in this. By applying paint in liquid pools on surfaces such as paper or other fibrous materials, it causes a veneer to build up that is rich in palpable textures through the chemical processes triggered within the paint and the surface. The mixtures not only create particular textures in the work, but also seep into the fibers of the surface, causing its inner structure to adapt and reshape. This particular piece that you can see on screen actually continues to reshape depending on the temperature and humidity of the room it is placed in, which again shows the agency of materials as they interact with their surrounding circumstances. So I compose and mix my own paint material because it allows me to choose the reacting agents and therefore the textural outcome of a work. I usually prepare the paint mixture shortly before applying it to the surface so that the chemical components enter into a reactive state that will continue throughout the drying process. Due to the viscosity of the paint, this drying procedure can be extended from minutes to hours, or in most cases days, giving the components a longer time to interact not only with each other, but also the surface area. So the intrinsic trace is a two-stage procedure. The first being dependent on the planned process of me selecting the components and triggering the reaction, and the second being dependent on the organic happenstance of the material itself. The image on the left shows a work where the tension within the chemicals used are reflected in the different textures and glosses. So the focal point of the intrinsic trace lies within the surface area of the work. The image on the right shows one of the first pieces in which the dimensional aspect and an openness towards the surrounding space starts to become important to me. This will then lead to the works that are based on an extrinsic trace, which I will introduce in a minute. In a short interlude, I would like to highlight Enokura Koji, one of my current reference artists, that triggered the aforementioned change to the extrinsic trace works that will follow. His photographs that capture paint material transposed onto the surface area of rooms were a primary influence on my thinking about and seeing of trace as a point of contact between the material, the space, and the viewer. Moving on to the second and more recent type of trace that I work with, which is an extrinsic, outward, or spatial trace. This involves adapting a primed work to a given spatial circumstance, reconfiguring its structure through manipulation, such as folding, creasing, and tearing, and reevaluating the composition in context to the surrounding surface areas through the staining of the wall and floor space. So what differs here in comparison to the intrinsic trace is that the focus lies less on what is happening solely within the surface area of the work, but more on the context and its interaction with the surrounding space and surfaces. The work therefore consists of the imagery on the surface, its creased dimensionality, as well as the paint traces and supporting elements, such as metal spring clips, as an expanded part of the work. With the studio space functioning as the original activation site of these works, I strive to transfer elements of this casual studio intimacy into the final installation on site. I feel that by adding something studio specific, such as paint stains on the walls and floors, unusual support elements, or nonchalant work placement to the work on site, instead of solely setting up or relocating a work into an exhibition, the piece becomes reactivated in a different space, preserving parts of its primal energy. By creating an environment in which the raw studio state intersects with the polished exhibition appearance, I also want to draw attention to situations of becoming versus states of being, which brings us back to the notion of movement and transience and materialities, and their active open-ended transformation versus the solidified passive image that is sometimes attached to them. Heightening our awareness and perception for the language of materialities and the traces and effects that we and what surrounds us create serves to emphasize an awareness of ourself and our connection to the world. With the interactions that took place through and within the materials I work with, I want to showcase that we are shaped and marked by our encounters. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Victoria. I have a question about the idea of the indexical, which is a kind of visual process of how the eye is being guided by the material, the traces, and how the traces begin and end in one object or one paper. It moves, and how do you sort of like uh, install it, whether it's in the space or whether you're seeing it from the standpoint of the studio. Do you have any opinions about that?
Um, I would say that there's not necessarily a beginning or an ending in my works. I don't think there's this kind of hierarchy. I'd say it's more of a kind of heterogeneous overall piece where the traces really always intersect with each other. So there's no kind of linear reading of where something began and where it ends. It's more of this open-ended concept, especially if it's not a singular piece. As when I set them up in the studio, I also feel that the works kind of create this kind of relation between themselves as well. So it kind of always creates this more open atmosphere where everything just kind of intersects and interacts than more than just an isolated kind of piece or
Yeah. So
trace.
yeah. So it's the idea of kind of directionlessness, no, directionlessness, in the way one would engage with um, the whether it's a kind of trace from a paper or a kind of installation where you place filters on some of the black images, and I think the idea of this vagueness of how the viewer would try to negotiate um, seems to be a important part of the practice. Yeah. I have a question from Olga. Since chemical reactions and traces are used, do you observe trace changes in time?
That's a very good question. And actually, one of the favorite aspects of my studio practice is that, as I mentioned with the intrinsic trace a few slides beforehand, it's not only me working as an artist on a piece, it's actually also me working with the materials together. So especially for the pieces where where I pour the paint material, I can always observe when I come in the next day how things have changed and how the materials themselves and the chemicals and the reactions are kind of starting to form these pieces. And since it's not a it's not a thing that's done in a minute, but over a variety of days, you can kind of observe in the duration and the time how things keep changing and keep changing. So every day that I come into the studio, I'm always there's always a surprise element as well. And I think that's the beauty of working with something that's also based on happenstance and different factors that kind of play into your work, that you're always negotiating and renegotiating with what's happening in your work and how you want to use it or don't want to use it. So I think that's definitely an important aspect in my work.
I have another question from Lizzie. Do you have any opinions in drawing associations with alchemy or scientific magic in your pigment material making? And is there an ideal outcome of your research, or is it more of a means of cataloging your outcomes and traces of these various experimentations?
Mm. Thank you for the question. I think that also kind of relates back to what Olga just asked. Um, Obviously, what's happening in the work is based on scientific chemical triggerings, but it does have this element of magic when things just kind of start to take shape. So I would I would say that alchemy kind of plays into the work as well. And regarding the second part of the question was regarding, could Ian, could you maybe repeat the second part of the question?
Oh, the second part is, or is it more of a means of cataloging
Ah,
your outcomes and traces of these various experimentations?
yeah. So I don't think there's an ideal outcome. I also never have an ideal outcome in mind when I work because I like to be surprised by what I do. So maybe I'd have a vague idea, but I really get to the kind of finished pieces through just the process of working and being in the studio. And the nice thing is that I also tend to integrate new elements and ingredients, and I'm always in the search of something new to discover. So a big part of my work is just being in the studio, interacting with the materials, seeing how they react, and then based on that, always pushing forward. So the experimental aspect is something that kind of keeps me engaged and in love with the work that I do. So if I'd have an ideal outcome, I think it would kind of maybe dampen the interest in it because of my love for the surprise.
So we have time for one more question. Yes. So from Pratibha, since your works are all about interaction with materials, chemical reactions, and how they shape things, like in the paperworks, do you plan on using video as a medium to document and present as a work piece?
Thank you for the question. I didn't think about incorporating video as a part of my practice until about a few weeks ago. But I am becoming interested in not as a soul work, but maybe incorporating it with the other pieces that I'm doing at the moment to capture exactly what Olga also mentioned about that aspect of duration and of time and how things change over time. So I'm planning on doing a video work in the near future where I film what is happening in the piece as it reacts or as it disintegrates or as the components change. Um, so yeah, I'm planning on doing some video work as well.
Thank you very much, Victoria Hertel. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we'll get you to move your screen to Elyssia Bugg. Yeah. So Elyssia Bugg, the title of her presentation is called Encountering Infinity, Object-Based Practice at the Intersection of Monoha and Arte Povera. Elyssia Bugg is currently completing a PhD at the University of Melbourne. Her research interrogates notions of performativity as they relate to sculptural works from the Arte Povera movement. Her writing has appeared in publications including Real Time Magazine, Projects, and Memo Review. So without further ado, welcome Elyssia Bugg. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Can everyone hear me fine? Is that okay?
It's good.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, before I start, I would just like to say that I'm presenting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to acknowledge that this is stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded. My presentation today is going to discuss a couple of points of intersection that arose between the Italian Arte Povera movement and the Japanese monoha movements in the late 1960s. And specifically, I'm going to compare the way in which the artists Giovanni Anselmo and Lee Ufan explored the relationship between particularity and universality in their practices by engaging objects in what Anselmo termed situations of energy. Before we look at their works, though, I want to provide some context as sort of a means of justification for why these two movements, and specifically these two artists, might be examined in this way. So by the late 1960s, both the Japanese and Italian states were facing rising tides of mass protest that were characterized by a militant desire to conceptualize and enact new models for understanding and organizing the world. Against the backdrop of this sharp increase in radicalization and rethinking of the structures and relations that constitute life under capitalism, an exchange between the Japanese art world and that which existed in Turin at the time was being fomented. In 1959, French critic Michel Tapier oversaw a number of shows in Turin that featured Gutai artists. Geographical context is, I think, important here, as Turin would go on to become the center of the Arte Povera movement in the late 1960s, in part because of the cross-cultural exchange that figures like Tapier facilitated. And to get a sense of the impact this had, critic Germano Chalant, who authored the manifesto for the Arte Povera movement, has described the Japanese influence in Turin as providing Arte Povera with a sense of permission in developing its particular approach to materiality and installation-based practices. As Arte Povera and the monoha emerged out of their respective cultural moments, this recent history of cross-cultural reference saw both perceptive and at times problematic comparisons almost immediately drawn between the movements. Subsequently, works from both monoha and Arte Povera were often exhibited in relation to one another in contexts such as the 1970 Tokyo Biennale. This framing of the movements as complementary continues today, with exhibitions such as 2014's Parallel Views, which is shown here in installation at the Warehouse in Dallas, seeking to elaborate on the historical and material connections between these two movements. So this then brings me to the specific parallels between Anselmo and Lee's practices. My reasoning in approaching the subject through this comparison is in part informed by a tendency in the literature and curatorial practice that compares Arte Povera and monoha to overstate the similarity of the materials used at the expense of other equally significant elements of the works. For instance, in the catalogue for this exhibition, Parallel Visions, Lee's Relatum work from 1969 that features a large rock atop a mirror is placed alongside Michelangelo Pistoletto's mirror work Cubic Meter of Infinity for comparison. While useful in its own right, this kind of materials focus side by side overlooks what I think is perhaps the most profound aspect of these earlier sculptural pieces by Lee, which is their use of energy. It's this tension between the event past and that which is potential that both reflects Lee's unique interpretation of Monohar's thingness and that shares much in common with Anselmo's practice and conception of poor art. To delve deeper into this relationship, I'm going to look at that aforementioned piece by Lee, as well as Anselmo's 1968 piece, Torsione, or Torsion. So this is Torsion. Anselmo began a 1969 artist statement saying, quote, "I, the world, things, life, we are all situations of energy," end quote. This understanding of energy as a universal and universalizing force was reflected in the artist's practice during the late 1960s, as between 1967 and 1970, Anselmo's works comprised of these situations that made visible the exchange and embodiment of various kinds of energy. In Torsion, this is played out by the interaction of a length of leather that is wrapped around a bar. In some versions of the work, the leather is attached to the wall, while others see it tethered to a concrete block, as you can see here. The objects are installed by way of the artist twisting the bar and by extension the leather as far as the materials will allow, and this subsequently transfers the energy of his action into the composition, where it remains suspended or held in place by the object's mutually transformative relationship. As critic Daniel Sudiff writes, quote, "Whether it is a matter of torsion, magnetism, or gravity, Anselmo produces situations in which energy literally becomes the organizer of the space in which it is stored. This is due to the fact that one is always at the limits of a point of rupture, on the edge of an equilibrium, or on the verge of breaking," end quote. Comparatively, this work by Lee exceeds that breaking point, all but to achieve similar ends. One of the initial pieces from the Relatum series, this work features the compositional aftermath of a slab of stone that has been dropped by the artist onto a sheet of glass, shattering it. It is, in this sense, an embodiment of energy exchanged, whereas Torsion stores the energy of the act, Lee's work reveals its dispersal. Like Torsion, however, this piece sees the interaction of the two objects, the stone and the glass, manifest a marker of an event or an exchange of energy. And in the case of Torsion, this exchange occurs in the artist's winding up of the leather, while in Relatum, it is the impact of the dropped stone. Significantly, and in service of the notion that it is not what these works are composed of, but how they are composed that is of interest here, both pieces were designed to be repeat actions rather than discrete objects, and were composed in varying forms, but always to the same or similar effect. So there are two facets of the work's use of energy that I think are most notable. The first is the way in which the compositions establish a non-hierarchical set of relations. This was an important ideological facet of both artists' practices that reflects their personal philosophical convictions and the repercussions of 1968's radical political rhetoric globally. As Mika Yoshitake writes, quote, "Lee aims to subordinate the artist as a producer in favour of the notion that all elements are inseparable and non-hierarchical. All parts, according to Lee, the viewer, as well as the rock and the glass and their placement, matter equally and are equally matter," end quote. This was part of an ongoing attempt by Lee to displace subjectivity within his work, and is to an extent then mirrored in Anselmo's works, which tend to collapse subject and object relations within a field of reciprocal encounter. The second significant aspect of the work's use of energy extends directly from this rejection of hierarchies, and is concerned with the revelation of the unseen. In a 1973 artist statement, Anselmo wrote, quote, "Even if the contingent human limits do not allow me to completely follow or identify all the points in the universe, these points really do exist as a physical dimension and are in any case available to us," end quote. We see this concern with how to see the invisible made tangible from Lee also when he says, "Only by mastering a way to manifest the as it is does one begin to see the unseen," end quote. This as it is a key aspect of both Monohar's thingness and Arte Povera's poverty, yet it's expressed in these two works in particularly profound ways. To explain, the works manifest universal principles such as gravity that are essential or foundational. However, these principles are without visible form. Consequently, the interaction of matter and materials in the works creates a lens through which to view these invisible factors that, despite being formless themselves, nonetheless can be actualized at intersections such as those facilitated by Anselmo and Lee. In this way, the artists access the as it is, not simply by using ordinary or poor or minimalist materials, but in the sense of opening an aperture through which to view the elemental structuring principles of the world as a whole. It is worth noting here that Lee differed to some of his contemporaries involved in monoha on this point. While some artists such as Kishio Shuga proposed a strategy of simply representing objects in and of the world, Lee argued that the artist's mediation was crucial, as it was this factor that had the potential to expand what can be seen and thus understood about the world in its totality. As Tadahara Akira writes, quote, Lee's mediating human act of dislocation gives rise to new visible relationships, while leaving things alone does not, end quote. Like Lee, Anselmo was conscious of the role he played in creating the optimum conditions through which the totality of the universe might be grappled with or encompassed. And this is evidenced in both artists' concern with the malleable relationship between what is visible and invisible. As such, we find what is perhaps a closer alignment here between Lee and Anselmo's work on this question than we do between Lee and some of his fellow monoha artists. Further to this, in his essay, Beyond Being a Nothingness, Lee writes that, quote, instead of turning the world into an object of cognition like an objet, the act releases the world into a non-objective phenomenon. That is, the act points to the manner in which the world worlds, end quote. This analysis, I think, presents the act as a means of comprehending not what constitutes the world in terms of static objects, but how the world as a continuum or totality is constituted in an active sense. Consequently, the visual evidence of pent-up energy and torsion or indication of energy expelled in relatum gestures to a totality that is infinitely in motion, the product of constant elemental exchange that, though often unseen, is, to quote Anselmo again, nonetheless available to us. In this way, and precisely because of the artist's shared impulse towards opening up the world through these acts of exchange and encounter, we might then see it as necessary to view their practice as akin, not primarily in terms of materials, but in terms of these works' particular expression of interaction and energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elyssia. So looking at the, I'll just start off with observation. Looking at the parallel views exhibition, or was it a space, like an installation space, where you had the various combinations of works from Monoha and Arte Povera. Do you feel that the curating is always, it could be very problematic sometimes because you talked about the idea of the energy trace being almost disrupted or maybe even cancelled because if you, depending on how you situate them in a kind of group setting.
Yeah, I think that exhibition, it's maybe unfair partially to use it as an example, but because it was largely building on what was available in the warehouse has quite a large collection of monoha works, and so it was building on what was in that collection in terms of that. But it's sort of repeated then in the catalogue and then in how sort of other sources that I've looked at talk about the works, which I think when they're talked about like individually, these things are sort of acknowledged and discussed at length, but then when they're compared, they're kind of relegated to these very materialistic compositions, which I think, at least in Lee's case and definitely in Anselmo's case, that was something that they were trying to sort of not necessarily overcome. Like they're not interested in this sort of transcendental idea, I don't think, but I think it was something that they were trying to move past in terms of their compositions that is then, yeah, but it's strange that it comes up when or maybe to be expected when the works are compared, because it's the obvious sort of visual comparison that you can draw between them maybe.
Yeah, I think the arrangement of things, you know, which is pretty much the philosophy of a lot of these kinds of works, have original history of where it was installed. And then as time goes by in terms of art history, there are many permutations of these kinds of arrangements. And of course, one would read differently in terms of a different kind of, depending on how the curator is sensitive and is undoubtedly you will definitely disturb that purity. Yeah. And I'm also reminded, looking at what you have presented, of a work by Kishio Suga, where he actually arranged tried to install a timber on a window. I think the original installation was done in a kind of a rundown kind of studio space. And I think they tried to reconstruct that performance, or that work, in the National Gallery about, I think, 2 years back, in the minimalism show. I don't know whether you saw it. And then it caused a crack onto the furnishings. Yeah. And it's quite interesting to see how that crack. I wasn't sure how that would to see how that worked with the kind of purity of that you can't the purity is almost is impossible, and furthermore, by reinforcing the fact that you need to install it and to squeeze it into a frame that is smaller than what the object is, creates a lot of problems.
Yeah, I think there's there's a lot of interesting things, because it was the same with the Arte Povera. Like, they're installing them in these rundown, like, kind of like palatial settings in Turin when they originally installed them. And then the artists are quite sensitive to like how they're reinstalled and that kind of thing. But yeah, obviously as they become like marketable objects, that also becomes a problem, I think, as well.
Yes. I've got a question from Claire. I'm really interested in the artist's performative action intervention with the materials. I'm wondering about the transference of energy that occurs in the action of making. Can you share any insights on this in regards to these two artists? It was great to see in 2011 of Lee. It was great to see the 2011 shot of Lee remaking the work.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, because the artists don't talk about the works as like performance works, but there is this like, because I think similar to what Victoria was talking about before, actually, the idea of the trace, or the indexical sort of marker, is what's kind of important theoretically in them. But there is all of this documentation for both artists, actually, of them doing the install, which is kind of interesting, I think, because it fits within a whole history of like avant-garde and like modern, and then moving into conceptual art at this time, where this process was like always documented. But yeah, I think for Anselmo and Lee, they both talk about like their body and the way that they're not as individuals, but in its relationality to the work. And so Anselmo has this kind of way of seeing the world that is like very not like not a monism, but it's like an idea of this sort of like infinite interconnectability of everything, and so he sees himself as an artist within that, which is the lack of hierarchies thing as well, I think. And Lee's comes much more from like a Heidegger sort of that's his like philosophical like crutch, I guess, that he returns to again and again in these works, but or when he talks about these works. But yeah, I think both of them see themselves and the act they perform as just like one more act in like a world that is a series of actions or something. Yeah, I don't know, that was probably just confused it, but thanks for your question, Claire.
Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next presenter, Chris Parkinson. All right, just want to welcome Chris to give his presentation. So for Elyssia to stop the screen share and allow Chris to come in. Yeah. So Chris Parkinson would be presenting his talk on the century and the surreal. Chris Parkinson is a multidisciplined artist whose practices are tethered to the street and the creative articulation of that experience across cultures. As an artist working primarily in photographic processes and practices. Parkinson remixes the visual vocabulary of the urban landscape in compositions indebted to seriality and abstraction. Parkinson's socially engaged creative practice, which incorporates production, curatorial, and conceptual concerns, has an enduring career tethered to East Timor. His 2010 book, Piece of Wall, Street Art from East Timor, is described as a book of evocative photojournalism capturing an important moment in East Timor's history through its walls. His long-term collaboration with East Timorese artists developed the Animatism Collective, a cross-cultural collective of artists working on creative diplomacy projects between Australia, East Timor, and Indonesia, framed by the Indonesian, East Timorese, and Australian relationships since World War II. So without further ado, welcome Chris Parkinson. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you all for an inspiring day here, an inspiring Thursday. And I'm here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, who on this land the other morning, I was lucky enough to enter the pool. And the sunlight dancing across the water's surface was a fresh perspective for 2020, prohibited as we have been to flow. The rhythm, the repetitive motion, the structured breathing. These moments for me represent a sanctuary to the everyday that I feel in my body, in my mind, and in my senses. With its newfound COVID-safe scheduling, blocks of time dictate access, meaning that up to 32 people enter the pool sanctuary for their allocated 45-minute block. A voice without a face declares time, and swimmers take their last strokes, submerge their bodies in the bubbles of their exhaling breath, and exit. Stillness and the genteel redressing of people along the pool's periphery materialize. Before COVID, one's own ritual within this space only added to the repetitive rolling of the pitter-patter of the water's turbulence as bodies carve through it, a medley of time frames and revolving doors into the aquatic architecture. Now, however, the pool calms. Stasis highlights absence. The sun shimmers along the water's surface. The water waits for the next block of time and bodies. An interstitial space in the block's imposed order and structure materializes. Why this observation, you might ask? When life progressed as it did before the shadow of COVID, you couldn't technically take a photo in or of the pool without permission from the pool's management system or the absence of people. Child-safe standards, privacy, and regulation prevent this activity from happening without it being regulated. The spontaneous sun-drenched imagery of swimming pools swarming with people, photographed by amateur, hobbyist, and professional photographers through time, at least in Australia, no longer exists in such abundance in the regulated framing of our lives. Yet the block of structure, indebted as it is to COVID-19, creates an interstice where taking an unauthorized photo of a pool is possible. Indeed, as others release their phones from their bags to capture the moment, it's almost necessary. COVID-19 and the rhythms that have resonated from its viral essence present these interstitial moments. Might they facilitate the formation of a frontier or a reconsideration of the often impermissible, perhaps even the impossible? Dependent, as this is, of course, upon one's privilege to access such a site of sanctuary. Thus, it is with this interpretation of the interstitial motif in the context of now that my research connects to a lineage of 15 years of creative cross-cultural and multidisciplinary exchanges between Australian, Timorese, and in the last 6 years, Indonesian artists. These engagements have always been indebted to the interstitial. The demonstration of Timor-Leste's graffiti, a cultural product addressing the challenges of nation building and citizenship through its capacity to identify with and simultaneously critique the dominant culture of the post-independence state established by the country's older generation, revealed the ongoing power of historical, urban, and regional identities in presenting a unified national story. Inscribed into this broader historical and heritage reality, graffiti negotiated a cultural and historical juxtaposition that reconfigured the resonance of the country's architecture. It added to the possibility of the continued and lived destruction as not just a vestige, but as an active substrate for memory retrieval, an effective architecture. Resulting from this interface, a singular story of the wall became diminished, embedding a further narrative upon these surfaces that drew upon an alternative archaeology or alternative geography of East Timor, creating what archaeologist John Schofield sees as a documentation of interstitial places, the social meaning of which is confined to certain, often excluded groups in society. End quote. Collaborations between myself and a number of artists central to the flourishing of graffiti in Timor-Leste then diversified, with cameras and video perpetually documenting performance and painting. Documentation began thickening an aesthetic and expressive continuum. We began painting into video, encouraging disciplinary exchange and an embrace of the slippages and interactions occurring between us. Again, through an attentiveness to the interstitial that emerged from the pleaching of threads flung from a predefined structure of practice, we were met with discovery. The multiple functionality of video as method and art, allowing us to furnish our collaborations with a newly developed cycle of collaboration that functioned as debrief, dialogue, and reflection, locating art and cultural expression between multiple cultures and multiple disciplines as a central point of this process. How now, myself and my collaborators measure the quotidian aesthetic rhythms of our distorted social practice where we can, at least for now, no longer find ourselves together on the street, embodying shared experiences and social interconnectedness, but operating through the cloud, is to seek verisimilitude and vitality in the interstitial spaces inherent in the structures and reality of a social space that hums now to a significantly altered rhythm, a syncopation, if you will. In order to analyze a rhythm, Henri Lefebvre states, one must get outside it. Externality is necessary. And yet in order to grasp a rhythm, one must have been grasped by it, have given or abandoned oneself inwardly to the time that it rhythmed, end quote. If, through the studies of rhythms, we lend ourselves to issues of change and repetition, identity and difference, contrast and continuity, this focus might afford us an opportunity to realize the aesthetic and social complexity of the displacement of life in the street, connecting to the visual and spatial politics and social practices of art collectives in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and Dili, Timor-Leste, where colonial assumptions of art and its relation to urban politics become entangled in differential collaborative relations to the event and, as such, a different registry of rhythms that inflect these spaces. Here, the non-representational lens, with its capacity to flirt with as opposed to represent reality, is useful in the way it enables an imaginative integration with Portuguese social theorist Boaventura de Sousa Santos and the proposition of Southern theory. The epistemologies of the South are a theoretical body that allows us to think in a critically different way about the construction, not only social, but also potentially colonial, of the concept of art and cultural engagement. Here, hybrid forms, non-representational rhythms and effect gather solidarity and galvanize practice in, as Santos himself suggests, the interstices in the rhythms and silences and partners in conversation, end quote. Our conversation now begins with the representation of one, indeed mine, creative experience during the most recent and stringent Melbourne lockdown. 1 hour photo, a collaboration between myself and Melbourne photographer Dan Sibley, was a test to scope the possibilities of the interstitial manifestations of a boxed existence. My accompanying exegesis for the show reads as follows. I personally feel that a box, far from being a dead end, is an entrance to another world. I don't know to where, but an entrance to somewhere, some other world. That's a quote from the Japanese author Kobo Abe from a book of his, The Box Man. Throughout the year 2020, what has sanctuary looked like for you? In Melbourne, life is composed of the COVID-19 context of a city with an amplified closure, temporal and spatial injunctions regulating engagement with the world around you, 6+ weeks of an 8 p.m. curfew, a 5-kilometre restriction upon movement from home in a 1-hour window with one other person only. Jackknifed as we are into the repeating motifs of ourselves being multiple selves in one location, the home. Here, the spinning wheel of techne sharpens, splinters, morphs, and converges all the things you think you are. Failings, a fluid foundation for the aspiration of tomorrow. Overwhelm, a metronomic itch that can't be scratched. Home, a deepened emotional battlefield. Might it be that home, if one is fortunate enough to infer the grandiose claim of sanctuary upon a home, is no longer a location of retreat? By imposing boundaries upon the boundaries structuring our engagement with the public sphere, we sought the sanguine through the grid. Here we found sanctuary in the surreal. Sanctuary in the serial. Sanctuary in the surreal. Conceptually plundered, the grid, a fixed, contained vision of structure, is indebted, beyond the artistic, aesthetic, and mathematic, to organizing principles predicated upon the management of aspirations, control, and administration of cities. As anthropologist James C. Scott infers in Seeing Like a State, an emphasis on simplification, legibility, straight lines, central management, and a synoptic grasp of the ensemble. End quote. The repetitive physical cartography of our proposal of the grid meant nuance emerged for the simplistic, embedding depth in the observational and lived experiences of this construct. Here, we watched as the semiotics of regulation created slipstreams in time and space, encouraging forays into the grid's inner crosshatch, yielding furtive spaces that elasticated time. If photography operated as an ethnographic tool, then what we learnt was that the quotidian of a box existence evidently expands itself as an aesthetic frontier, paying homage to the words of Rosalind Krauss in her deeply engaged theory on grids, of its impetus to impose an aesthetic decree. With recurrence, refinement, and rigor, the grid inside our boxed containment affixed a notion of sanctuary for its capacity to afford us entrance to somewhere, some other world. What we discovered was a palindrome of process that evidently manifests a consistent rhythm drawn from the arrhythmic stutter of the now. Now, my inherently discursive approach to this presentation is intentional, for it's part of the promise of non-representational theory, to allow entanglement between relations and objects, to cultivate meshworks in order to broker the possibility of embedding the imaginative into developing what we know. Says Philip Vanini in a paper dedicated to unearthing 5 different thematic focal points within non-representational ethnographies. Non-representational ethnography seeks to cultivate an affinity for the analysis of events, practices, assemblages, structures of feeling, and the backgrounds of everyday life against which relations unfold in their myriad potentials. Non-representational ethnography emphasizes the fleeting, viscous, lively embodied material more than human precognitive non-discursive dimensions of spatially and temporally complex life worlds, end quote. As a photographer whose career has been wedded to the form as a tool for the documentation of the events that have created atmosphere in this non-representational guise, it's now a tool to begin building the architecture for creating those atmospheres from inside the event. The development of a visual vocabulary of effect to enable knowledge to build to understand the conditions, compulsions, and motivations of my collaborators, to shed light upon the inherently social materialism embedded in their everyday lives and engagement with creativity and public space. It is a practice that sustains dialogue with multiplicity and the metaphorical through creating an indeterminate vocabulary of ecemic palindromes that endeavor to represent the ebb and flow of rhythms, collaborations, and theory. Composed and structured through an adherence to the structure of the grid, their open semantic forms are intended to be read in dialogue with research that is grounded by a social system of relationships where the syncopation of styles is more concerned with interconnection than rigid qualification and resolution. It is here in the sanctuary of the grid that the words of Rosalind Krauss bind the seriality of its manifestation to the possibility of the surreal. For in the grid, as Krauss enthuses, we have discovered that one of the most modernist things about it is its capacity to serve as a paradigm or model for the anti-development, the anti-narrative, the anti-historical, end quote. To probe the ways in which the visual and spatial politics of the city express historical conditions and urban subjectivities, and how collective and public art practices and practitioners in the urban precincts of Yogyakarta and Dili engage with their cities as a working material, is to connect unique public contexts with creative practices, inviting narratives of connectivity and collaboration within our region across aesthetic, creative, and process-orientated practices. The process, practice, and presentation of this work seeks to expand upon ethnographic, photographic documentation and representation, opening itself to a dialogic process of collaboration to represent affect as it occurs in public space, to open up city spaces and events so we can better reflect on the complex textures, feelings, and experiences of urban space.
Sorry, you need to wrap very soon.
Yeah, sure. As a proposal for collaborative promise, we have begun coding the spooling seriality, pattern, and vocabulary of the grid. As we enter the aesthetic systems of the grid to flay it, to find newness and hybridity between us, we question how the desire for order harbors within itself a drive towards disorder. A collaboration's a matter of measure and unmeasure, of location and dislocation, of rules and unruliness, of making holes where holes should be. Thank you, and apologies for going slightly over, Ian.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. Just looking at slides 6 to 9 and how the imagery of overlaying is being used. Can you talk a little bit about how when you have the abstraction being overlaid, what are your ideas about this? When you overlay something, you know, a new image emerges, yeah. And what do you think about this idea of this new image when something, or new relationship when this overlay is being done?
Well, I think from my experiences, it's the revealing of that newness within the repetition and cycle of developing an idea, that where the inspiration and the innovation comes within a sort of collaborative context. And I sit in this quite interesting location of trying to elaborate upon my own practice. It's, you know, indebted to this idea of the serial and repetition, and noticing the expansion that occurs within that, and the constant breaking down of images and ideas that occurs within that. And I correlate that to the way that we kind of structure our collaborations, and the way that through that constant redress and breaking down of our own ideas that are drawn together, that we then come up with the new.
So if you think about Mondrian's early abstractions of the city in terms of the New York grid, and looking at the various permutations of abstraction from the 80s, 90s, where a kind of organic, almost chaotic kind of arrangement is being manifested, influence in terms of the psychology of the city. Do you think that this is something that you use? Because I think looking at slide 6 to 9, although they are monochromatic, there is a kind of I sense there is a kind of irregularity to it, you know, or a non-symmetrical relationship, except for maybe the bluish tinge one.
Yeah. So, and this is I'm really glad, Ian, that you've kind of touched on that. And it represents, I guess, 3 different ways that I approach the construction of these images too. Images 6 to 9 or 6 to 10 really open themselves to chance. They are developed through a real practice of shooting through windows, mirrors, glass, and reflections. And as that practice sort of developed, it began intersecting with my interest in graffiti. And I used to be a graffiti writer, as we call it. And one of my quests was then to use this idea of the multiplicity that I saw emerging through reflections and how I could continue to, I guess, write graffiti in a way. And I transposed that reflection, quite often done in film, into this idea of multiple exposures that began in film, now take on more of a digital construct. And as you identify, there is a little more spontaneity to them because it is indeed the technical aspects of the camera that define the structure. I compose each 3 exposures within a grid of the viewfinder of the camera, yet how the camera kind of responds to that and configures them is up to the device itself. What that kind of process led to then was how I can have more agency in the construction of the images. And so in taking the singular exposures down and returning, I guess, to the tactility of print as well, I began just cutting up the singular kind of exposures, which gave me the structure that I had more control over, and then brought about this new sort of meta practice of being able to then zoom into small aspects of each image, expand it, throw it back into a grid, and continue to generate this evolution of a singular image into multiple manifestations. And again, you know, it's still developing, I guess, its application to collaboration, but the same ethos exists within the way that I work with my Timorese and Indonesian collaborators. And so what I'm really trying to work towards here is this integration of this idea of multiplicity and recurrence and how it sits within collaboration of a social practice, essentially.
Thank you, Chris. I had something to do with flatness that I wanted to ask, but I think we need to end here. And
Right,
perhaps we
thanks.
can do an exchange on email about this,
Sure thing.
flatness and space. So without further ado, I want to start to introduce our next speaker, Duncan Collard. Yeah, and I'm going to read his title. So, sleep cinema, art cinema, installation, and inattention in Apachapong Versantakul works. So the biography, I'll just read the short version of it. Duncan Collard is a final year PhD candidate in screen and cultural studies at the University of Melbourne. His doctoral research addresses emptiness in the works of Apachapong Varasantakul, concentrating on the intersections of space, inactivity, and silence in contemporary international art cinema. He is currently researching phenomenologies of sleep in cinema and contemporary art. In addition to his research, he programs immersive media at the Hawaii International Film Festival and is a coordinator of the Screening Ideas program at the University of Melbourne. So take it away, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I'd just like to add my acknowledgements of country and to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Nam, known as Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So my presentation today emerges out of some fieldwork that I did in 2018 at Apichatpong's Sleep Cinema Hotel at the International Film Festival Rotterdam. It's for anyone familiar with, for anyone familiar with Apichatpong's work, he is probably one of the most regarded international art filmmakers working today, but is also very active within contemporary art and produces these absolutely extraordinary films in which virtually nothing happens. But he's especially interested in sleep. And that's really drilling into this relationship between sleep and cinema, given that it sounds like an oxymoronic relationship is really the core of this paper and the chapter. So on a certain level, sleep is the absolute other of conventional art cinema. If you think about the ordinary films that you watch, it is extremely uncommon for sleep to be included as an active presence within the films themselves. If you think about The Avengers or any other mainstream entertainment film, it's extremely uncommon that characters will take any form of break, but especially a break to sleep. And as a result, the films that we watch or the TV programs that we see quite often have these almost insomniac, constantly acting characters that are in no way similar to what it's actually like to live in the world, in which we rest and spend 30% of our lives sleeping. But then on another level, cinematic spectatorship itself, so when we're actually watching movies as bodies in a cinema, sleep is really quite taboo. You've paid for a film ticket, so why would you then go to sleep during the film? If you're snoring really loudly, then that seems uncouth or taboo, and people will then be critical of you. But then also, you'll experience an incomplete film. If you sleep through a section of it, then you won't have experienced the whole film. And if, as a researcher, I was to write on a film that I'd slept largely through, it would be seen as an ethical problem that I actually haven't appreciated the text properly. And so there's this sense then that a cinema and cinema itself is a disciplinary space, a space which is designed in many ways to structure our attention and to enforce this highly attentive form of spectatorship in which sleep is impossible. I've included an article here from the BBC which discussed the banning of pajamas in cinemas. And even though we don't necessarily think about it so actively, especially while in lockdown, cinemas are highly regulated spaces in which what we do and how we watch are tightly controlled. Now, this is in large part due to a transformation of visual culture which took place in the 19th century. And what I'd like to emphasize here is that this highly concentrated, highly disciplined form of attentiveness, which is built into mainstream structures of conventional cinema, is contingent and historically specific. So Jonathan Crary, who has written really convincingly on this transformation of visual experience in the 19th century, writes that in that time, attention became a massive issue of capitalism, that in order to produce these industrial workers who are capable of focusing on a very specific task for extended periods of time, attention not only became an issue of capital, of efficiency, but also became, to a certain extent, a moral issue. If it was seen that we weren't paying attention or that we weren't paying attention to the right things, then that was seen as a form of deviance or a form of moral failing. And he writes, inattention, especially within the context of new forms of large-scale industrialized production, which we can situate cinema as both a technology and a viewing practice at the end of the 19th century as a form of industrialized production, began to be treated as a danger and a serious problem. And sleep, as this form of inattention, of not participating or not following action, then became this moral problem. And so if we return to this structure of the conventional cinema of a crowd of people sitting together in an auditorium, all facing the same direction in a darkened hall with loud sound, socially enforced silence, an almost all-encompassing image. The structure of the cinema itself is designed to direct our attention in this really highly concentrated way. If someone in the third row were to start sleeping or snoring, then that's a form of deviance and disruption within this highly disciplined space. And so we can't acknowledge that. But what's interesting is that for a Pitchapong, who is so interested in the possibility of sleep, he wants to imagine a cinema in which sleep is not only invited, but actually a crucial part of the experience. At Rotterdam, in an interview, a public interview connected to his installation, he stated, "It's just a dream to want to create a cinema specifically for sleeping. I feel because for me, over the years, I've become increasingly less and less interested in watching movies. Even through my own films, I sleep." And then in an earlier interview from back in 2011, he said he's comfortable with people sleeping through his movies because they'll wake up and piece things together in their own time. And so this idea that sleep exists in continuum with cinema rather than being in opposition to cinema is really quite a radical revision. And to sort of prototype this form of cinema, a Pitchapong created an installation at the Rotterdam International Film Festival called Sleep Cinema Hotel. I've got some pictures here associated with the festival, which I thought was so interesting. So you have a large circular screen and then this sort of structure of beds sitting at odd angles in the room, elevated to different points. The structure of the room, rather than being highly concentrated towards a single object, actually obscures objects. Rather than having a single point of concentration, there are permeations where the screen is actually visible from the street outside and people sleeping, because guests are able to sleep through this screening, are then visible to attendees. If you checked in, then you were given a blindfold, just in case the lights of the screen became too much and you wanted to sleep. It cost €50 for the night, which is actually quite a cheap hotel room. And you were constantly exposed to this large circular screen at the front of the room. Now, there was specific seating. So if you wanted to sit and watch the video stream, then you were able to do so. But notably, the video stream went for 1 hour, or 120 hours. So there was actually no, without repeating, so there was no way for spectators to get a whole or complete text. You had no choice but to watch the text as incomplete, which is then very different to what we expect with the conventional cinema. But throughout this complex, the structure of the beds actually obscure access to the screen. And if you look here, then much of your access to the screen comes from reflections from the walls, sort of rupturing this singular direction of attention. And the further into the room that you went, the more disrupted it became. So this isn't quite the view from one of the beds, but it approximates what it's like to actually view the screen from one of those beds. There was a 4-channel sound installation, which had noise of wind or water or snapping branches or wind through leaves, but there was nothing really structural, or nothing which informed a sort of narrative sense of events. And the video contents itself, rather than being from Thailand, like the rest of Pitchapong's work, are actually drawn from a Dutch film archive. So there's really nothing to hold on to in terms of the work itself. Instead, when you're sitting in the sleep cinema or participating in the sleep cinema, rather than having your attention concentrated at the screen itself, it's dispersed throughout the entire viewing situation, further disrupting the sense of straightforward or concentrated attention. And as I mentioned, it's this sense of constant permeation between inside and outside, of observing a screen, observing other people, but also yourself being observed by members of the public who could come in and then watch you as you were sleeping. So I would like to leave some time for questions, so I'll try and wrap up as easily as I can here. But what I'm considering in my research through this sleep cinema is how this radically changes or disrupts our conventional understanding of cinematic subjectivity. There's a presupposition that as we watch a movie that we're continuously attentive and that we pick up all information. But what if cinema, in a way which could incorporate sleep and understand sleep as something which is valid and necessary, was then able to accept incomplete texts, to allow this incomplete attention? And what would the consequences of that be? So while I don't have time to fully explore it here, what I'm exploring in the context of my research are really these three key implications of sleep cinema. First, a decentering of subjective attention. So a removal of this idea of myself as a viewer having a whole or total picture or uninterrupted picture of the film, and thinking about my attention as incomplete, as broken up or discontinuous, and then thinking about the implications there in terms of broader narrative cinema. Second, this idea of emancipating bodies and imaginations from what would necessarily be a conventional narrative, of enabling us to piece together movies ourselves rather than having this enforced linear narrative over a feature length. And then finally, rethinking cinemas rather than being a space in which I'm isolated from others, but actually intimately engaged with others, in which our shared bodies are coexisting within a space, are not simply subjects, but actually objects within those spaces. And that their speech, their snores, their passivity is actually an active part of this intimate encounter taking place within cinema. So I'll finish up there. Very, very quick trip through a very complex thing. But what I suppose, just to finish it off, is this idea that the sleep cinema is not a complete or perfect whole yet, but rather Apichatpong's work here is a prototype for a possible alternative cinema that challenges these structures of focus which dominate so much of our contemporary understanding of cinema. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan, for your talk. Again, reinforcing ideas about a non-beginning, a non-ending. Yeah. Also looking at Victoria's work and what Elyssia has been presenting. Yeah. It's really interesting to see this space, this sleep cinema, where it's totally. I wouldn't say destroyed, but it sort of like removes idea about. It's kind of sculptural because one would move through it, and it's also relational. So it combines various tropes or language, various kinds of disciplines from art, history of art actually, or contemporary art history, together with cinema. And how I do not know, because once it's being shown in this manner, one doesn't just see one forgets about the idea of the film as a membrane that is virtual, but instead it's we see it as a kind of screen that appears and disappears depending on where you move. Yeah.
No, and absolutely, and it's he was asked in connection to this installation, it's how do you define it? Is it a film? Is it a cinema? Is it an installation? And he said it's a hotel, and then refused to qualify it any further. But it's borrowing so many different sort of genres of attention, of the video installation, of sort of like a sculptural exhibition, as well as of cinema, in this really quite convoluted but fascinating arrangement. So absolutely.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the relationship between the countryside and the city. Yeah, and how we live and experience time differently. And I'm also thinking about how the idea of art in real life kind of collapse, because in real life, you don't need to think about the beginning or ending in terms of the lived experience. So it's a kind of experimentation that sort of like brings the two together. I have a question from Lizzie. In this time of pandemic, and when the act of attending an art event or going to the movies has become unsafe and in some cases impossible, what is your opinion on our homes and personal modes of viewing acting as the main location of consuming art and films?
I suppose, speaking from personal experience, I really miss cinemas, even though I'm sort of ripping on conventional cinemas here. and describing them as quite disciplined or repressive. I really value that sort of space, and especially watching like a challenging film with a group of people is really rewarding. So there's something that we miss there. But I think there's an element of ritual that's built into cinema that differs from, for example, television viewing, where I will settle down and enter into that ritual discipline space. And on that level, you can do that in your own home. That it's not just a requirement to be in a physical cinema space, that by, for example, setting aside a different room in your home or setting aside technology like phones that you can't have in that space, then it is possible to have that like quote unquote aesthetic experience in a home screen environment. But I also think in terms of our own viewing, that we can learn from sleep cinema in that context, and to think about being able to accept incomplete viewing or be a bit easier on ourselves, especially if you're watching a very difficult film, then sometimes maintaining continuous attention is quite difficult or challenging. And so I suppose the challenge of sleep cinema to that is to accept our own bodily limitations in watching things and to be able to live with discontinuous attention or be able to sleep through movies without feeling guilty about it. So I hope that's a little helpful, Lizzie.
So do we have another question? Yes, we have a question from Kenza Yap. This may not be so important, but you spoke about how the visuals are obscured from different points in the space. But would sound be distorted as well, depending on where you are situated? And in addition to this, what role does the sound play in the perception of film? How does it serve to support the visuals, or what would be the purpose of its presence?
Great. So really good question. So Apichatpong worked with his regular sound designer to produce a 4-channel soundscape. Each of those channels has a sort of a different duration and then will loop. And what's interesting there is the sound loops and the images don't. And so there's no synchronization between sound and image in this space. And I think that reinforces, in my view, sort of the irrelevance of the image themselves. Like whereas a conventional film is very carefully selected, or even sort of comparable video installations like The Clock or 24-Hour Psycho are very carefully selected. Whereas in this case, the video content is sort of irrelevant, and the connection between the content on screen and the sound aren't really that relevant. But what's interesting is there's actually, I think in that divorce between sound and image synchronization, there is something really interesting, that the sound, which does change depending on where you are in the room, because the different speakers are going to provide different channels of sound. The sound gives you much more of a sense of place, that it's much more specifically about being present in the room and this feeling of what it means to be present there, rather than what is happening on screen. And so, as you can see in the shot here, the light from the screen reflects onto these reflective walls. And so sound sort of functions in a similar way, where it's atmospheric rather than directional or purposeful. But yeah, a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's also interesting how you talked about Apichatpong very happy that people fall asleep and then they're waking up, because I think I'm thinking about how the memory, if there is sound and you fall asleep, the sound would be the only element that enters into your psyche, you know, because when you fall asleep, you don't see the visuals anymore, and then when you wake up, probably the idea of the sound still rings, and yeah.
And it's in the context of his films, it's really interesting because he has these really durational soundscapes where you'll have the same sound, whether it's just like crickets, which persists across multiple scenes.
Yeah.
So it's a much more peaceful soundscape than would be in a lot of conventional films. So another really interesting observation.
Yeah, and sound also gives us images actually. If even though sometimes we relate it to in cinema, you relate it to a particular incident or footage. But sometimes, but in this instance, if you fall asleep, then you would hear the sound with an image that is different, you know, from in your own headspace. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone for your time and for this session. I'll be closing this session and then reopening it for the next session, which starts at 12. So we've got 15 minutes before it starts. So I think we are in good time. So thank you everyone for presenting and thank you for all the questions and thank you for all your responses. So I'll see everyone at 12 for the next session, right? I think the next session would be 12 o'clock, and it's on for this room one is relationality and community. All right, so take care everyone. Bye bye.